The rescue beacon from Escape Pod Delta 7 had been broadcasting for 3 days when the Galactic Educational Council ship found it drifting near the Outer Rim territories. Inside, wrapped in a thermal blanket and clutching a worn, stuffed animal, was a small human child who couldn't have been more than 12 standard years old. His name was Tommy Rivers, and he was the sole survivor of the colony ship New Hope, destroyed by engine failure during a routine jump to the Kepler system. Tommy's eyes were red from crying, but he tried to be brave when the alien rescue team found him. The tall, blue-skinned Meridian captain spoke gentle words through her translator device while her crew searched the debris field for other survivors. There were none. The boy's entire family, everyone he had ever known, was gone. The Galactic Educational Council had protocols for orphaned beings from developing civilizations. They would be given shelter, education, and eventually placement in suitable adoptive families within the galactic community. The process was handled by an advanced artificial intelligence system that could analyze a being's physiological and psychological development to determine the best educational path forward. But the system had never processed a human before. Humans were new to the galactic community, barely making first contact 3 years ago. The AI examined Tommy's brain scans, noting the complex neural pathways, the rapid synaptic firing, and the sophisticated language centers. It compared these readings to its vast database of known species and made what seemed like a logical decision. The boy was clearly intellectually advanced for his species. His brain activity matched that of graduate-level students from other civilizations. Therefore, Tommy Rivers would be enrolled in Advanced Xenobiology Level 7 at the prestigious Andromeda Learning Institute. Nobody thought to check that humans aged differently than most galactic species. Nobody realized that a 12-year-old human was still very much a child, despite having a brain that could process complex information. The system saw neural complexity and assumed intellectual maturity. Professor Quilm received the enrollment notification while reviewing his lesson plans for the new term. The distinguished Heridian scholar had been teaching advanced xenobiology for over 3 centuries. His students were typically mature beings from various species, all of whom had completed decades of preliminary studies. They came to his class, ready to tackle the most complex mysteries of life in the galaxy. The notification mentioned a new student named Tommy Rivers, species designation human, age classification unclear due to limited data. Professor Quilm made a mental note to research this species before classes began. In his long career, he had taught crystalline beings who thought in mathematical harmonies, gas-based entities who experienced time differently than solid creatures, and even uploaded consciousnesses from cybernetic civilizations. One more unusual species wouldn't present much of a challenge. The first day of class arrived with typical fanfare at the Institute. Students from across the galaxy gathered in the magnificent halls, their various forms of locomotion creating a symphony of sounds. The Vorthak clicked across the floors with their crystal limbs. The Keldon made soft splashing sounds as they moved through their mobility suits filled with their native brine, and the ethereal Fantech simply materialized wherever they needed to be. Professor Quilm's classroom was a marvel of technology, capable of displaying 3-dimensional models of entire ecosystems and simulating the conditions of any known planet. The walls could become transparent to show the real stars outside, or project detailed images of microscopic life forms. It was a space designed for the most advanced minds in the galaxy. The students filed in with quiet dignity, as was appropriate for beings of their intellectual caliber. They had spent decades preparing for this moment, studying the fundamental principles that would allow them to understand life in its most complex forms. Each had mastered multiple fields of study and proven their worth through rigorous examinations. Then, Tommy Rivers walked in. He was impossibly small compared to the other students, barely reaching the midsection of the smallest Vorthak. His clothes were simple and clearly designed for comfort rather than academic formality. In his arms, he carried a worn backpack that looked like it had been hastily packed, and peeking out from the top was the same stuffed animal he'd been clutching in the escape pod. The classroom fell silent. Professor Quilm, who had been preparing to begin his traditional welcome address, found himself staring at what was obviously a child. Not a small adult, not a being from a diminutive species, but an actual juvenile who should have been playing games and learning basic concepts, not sitting in the most advanced xenobiology class in the galaxy. Tommy looked around the room with wide eyes, taking in the alien faces staring back at him. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to say something, so he raised his small hand and gave a little wave. "Hi, everyone," he said in his clear, young voice. "I'm Tommy. I'm new here." The Vorthak students exchanged harmonic tones that roughly translated to confusion and disbelief. The Keldon made bubbling sounds that indicated deep concern. Even the normally composed Fantech seemed to flicker with uncertainty. Professor Quilm realized that someone had made a terrible mistake. This child belonged in a basic education program, perhaps learning simple mathematics or elementary language skills. He certainly didn't belong in a class designed for the most advanced minds in the galaxy. The boy probably couldn't even understand the basic terminology they would be using. But Tommy had already found an empty seat and was looking up at the professor with expectant eyes. There was intelligence there, unmistakably, but it was wrapped in the curiosity and wonder of youth rather than the serious contemplation of advanced scholarship. The professor cleared his throat and decided to proceed with the class, while he figured out how to handle this unprecedented situation. Perhaps he could gently explain to the child that he was in the wrong place, then arrange for proper placement. In the meantime, he would begin with his standard introduction to advanced xenobiological principles. "Welcome to Advanced Xenobiology Level 7, Professor Quilm began, his translated voice filling the room. "In this course, we will explore the most complex forms of life in the galaxy, examining the intricate relationships between organisms and their environments across multiple dimensional phases." Tommy nodded seriously as if he understood every word. He pulled out a simple notebook and a pencil, tools that seemed almost primitive compared to the advanced recording devices his classmates were using. But he was ready to learn, and something in his earnest expression made Professor Quilm hesitate before suggesting the boy leave. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this human child than met the eye. 3 weeks had passed since Tommy Rivers first walked into Professor Quilm's advanced xenobiology class, and the professor was beginning to question everything he thought he knew about intelligence and learning. The small human child, who should have been completely lost in discussions of complex evolutionary theory, was not only keeping up with his graduate-level classmates, but was making observations that left even the professor speechless. It started during the second week when Professor Quilm was explaining the symbiotic relationship between the crystal worms of Vega Prime and the silicon trees they inhabited. The relationship had puzzled xenobiologists for decades because the benefits seemed entirely one-sided. The worms appeared to take nutrients from the trees while giving nothing back, yet both species thrived together in ways they couldn't achieve separately. The Vorthak students had spent hours analyzing the chemical exchanges, creating complex mathematical models to understand the relationship. The Keldon had memorized every known detail about both species and could recite their biological processes with perfect accuracy. The Fantech had contemplated the philosophical implications of such seemingly unequal partnerships. Tommy had been quietly drawing pictures in his notebook during the entire discussion. Professor Quilm assumed the boy was simply doodling to stay occupied, a childish behavior that was endearing if not particularly academic. But when the class reached an impasse in their analysis, Tommy raised his small hand. "Maybe the worms are like little janitors," Tommy said, his young voice cutting through the scholarly silence. "My mom always said the fish in her aquarium weren't just pretty to look at. The bottom feeders ate the stuff that would make the water yucky for the other fish. Maybe the worms eat the bad stuff that would hurt the trees." Professor Quilm felt his heart skip a beat. In 3 centuries of teaching, none of his students had ever suggested that the worms might be consuming harmful substances rather than nutrients. It was such a simple idea, so obvious in retrospect, yet it had never occurred to any of the brilliant minds who had studied this relationship. The class spent the next 2 hours excitedly testing Tommy's hypothesis. Sure enough, spectral analysis revealed that the crystal worms were indeed consuming toxic compounds that accumulated in the silicon trees, compounds that would eventually kill the trees if left unchecked. The boy had solved a decades-old mystery by thinking of it in terms of cleaning fish in his mother's aquarium. Word of the incident spread quickly through the institute. Other professors began dropping by Quilm's classroom, curious about the human child who was making graduate students look like beginners. They expected to find some kind of prodigy, perhaps a genetically enhanced being with capabilities far beyond normal human parameters. Instead, they found Tommy, who got excited about lunchtime, who sometimes forgot to raise his hand before speaking, and who had to ask for help reaching books on the higher shelves. He was undeniably a child in every way, except for his uncanny ability to see patterns and connections that eluded far more educated minds. During a lesson on extremophile organisms, Professor Quilm presented the class with data from the methane storms of Titan 7. The readings showed impossible survival rates for certain microorganisms during conditions that should have been instantly lethal. The advanced students applied their sophisticated analytical frameworks, but couldn't explain how any life form could exist in such an environment. Tommy studied the holographic display for a few minutes, then said, "They're probably hiding. Like when there's a really bad thunderstorm and all the animals go find somewhere safe to wait it out. Maybe they go somewhere the bad stuff can't reach them until it's over." The idea seemed too simple to be correct. Advanced organisms didn't just hide from adverse conditions. They developed complex biochemical defenses, altered their metabolic processes, or evolved specialized protective structures. But when the research team investigated Tommy's suggestion, they discovered that the microorganisms were indeed retreating into microscopic pocket dimensions during the storms, a behavior so basic that previous researchers had overlooked it entirely. While searching for more complex explanations, Tommy's success wasn't limited to biology. When the class moved on to ecological systems, he demonstrated an intuitive understanding of balance and interdependence that typically took students years to develop. He described food webs in terms of neighborhood communities, where everyone had different jobs but needed each other to make things work. He explained migration patterns by comparing them to his family's moves between colonies, understanding that creatures went where they could find what they needed to survive. His classmates began to change as well. The Vorthak, who approached learning through logical analysis and mathematical precision, started asking questions about why systems worked the way they did, rather than simply how they functioned. The Keldon, with their perfect memory recall, began to see connections between seemingly unrelated facts. Even the Fantech, who typically contemplated abstract concepts in isolation, started considering the emotional and social implications of biological relationships. Professor Quilm found himself staying after class almost every day, drawn into conversations with Tommy that challenged his fundamental assumptions about education and intelligence. The boy's questions were often embarrassingly simple, but they cut to the heart of complex theoretical frameworks that Quilm had been teaching for centuries without truly examining. Why do some animals fight and others become friends? Tommy asked one afternoon while they were reviewing footage of territorial disputes on Rigel 4. It was the kind of question that first-year students might ask, the kind that advanced scholars had moved far beyond. But as Quilm tried to answer, he realized that the standard explanations about resource competition and evolutionary advantage didn't fully capture the complexity of what they were observing. Some conflicts seemed to serve no purpose other than the conflict itself, while some cooperation occurred even when it provided no obvious benefit. Tommy's childish question opened up entirely new avenues of research. The other professors who visited the class began to understand what made Tommy so remarkable. It wasn't that he was more intelligent than his classmates in any traditional sense. The Vorthak could process information faster, the Keldon could retain more data, and the Fantech could contemplate more abstract concepts. But Tommy had something none of them possessed: the ability to approach problems without preconceived notions about how solutions should work. He saw symbiosis and thought of aquarium fish. He looked at extremophile survival and thought of storm shelters. He observed territorial behavior and wondered why anyone would choose fighting over friendship. His mind wasn't constrained by academic frameworks or species-specific thinking patterns. He was free to make connections that seemed obvious only after someone else pointed them out. Professor Quilm began to realize that Tommy wasn't just succeeding despite being a child. He was succeeding because he was a child. His young, human mind approached problems with a flexibility and creativity that more educated beings had trained themselves out of. He asked the questions that everyone else had learned not to ask. And in doing so, he was revolutionizing how the class understood life itself. The impossible student was teaching his teachers, and none of them were quite sure what that meant. For everything they thought they knew about education, intelligence, and the nature of wisdom. The morning Tommy Rivers solved the Great Migration mystery was the day the galactic academic community realized they had been fundamentally wrong about how intelligence worked. Dr. Henna Kolat, from the Institute's Department of Behavioral Sciences, had arrived early that day, hoping to observe the unusual human child who was causing such a stir throughout the university. Professor Quilm was presenting one of the most challenging puzzles in xenobiology, the inexplicable migration patterns of the void swimmers, massive space-dwelling creatures that traveled between star systems without any apparent navigation system. These magnificent beings, each the size of a small moon, would suddenly abandon rich feeding grounds to journey across empty space toward destinations that seemed to offer no benefits whatsoever. For over 200 years, the greatest minds in the galaxy had studied the void swimmers. They had built complex models accounting for gravitational influences, magnetic field variations, and solar radiation patterns. They had theorized about genetic programming, chemical trails, and quantum entanglement navigation. Every hypothesis had been tested and found wanting. The void swimmers continued their mysterious journeys, defying all attempts at explanation. Tommy sat in his usual seat, swinging his legs that didn't quite reach the floor, watching the three-dimensional hologram of void swimmer migration routes that filled the center of the classroom. The display showed centuries of tracking data, with glowing lines representing the paths these creatures took across the darkness between stars. To the advanced students, it looked like chaos. To Professor Quilm, it represented one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in his field. As you can see, Professor Quilm explained to his class and the visiting researcher, the migration patterns show no correlation with any known environmental factors. The void swimmers appear to make completely random decisions about when and where to travel. The Vortex students hummed in harmonic analysis, their crystal structures resonating as they processed the data through multiple logical frameworks simultaneously. The Keldon made soft bubbling sounds as they cross-referenced the migration data, with every known variable in their perfect memory banks. The Fantech shimmered as they contemplated the philosophical implications of purposeless movement across the cosmos. Dr. Kalat took careful notes, watching Tommy's reaction to the presentation. The human child seemed fascinated by the holographic display, but not in the way his classmates were. While they focused on the data points and mathematical relationships, Tommy was simply watching the pretty lights move through space with the wonder of a child seeing something beautiful. Professor Quilm, Tommy said, raising his hand as he had learned to do in class. Can I ask something about the void swimmers? Of course, Tommy. What would you like to know? Tommy stood up in his chair to get a better look at the hologram. Do they have babies? Like, do the mommy and daddy void swimmers have little ones they need to take care of? Professor Quilm felt that familiar sensation he had come to associate with Tommy's questions, the feeling that something important was about to happen. Yes, they do reproduce. The void swimmers have young, though we don't fully understand their life cycle. And where do they have their babies? Tommy continued, his curiosity evident in his voice. The reproduction process occurs in deep space, usually in regions with high concentrations of cosmic dust and minerals, Professor Quilm replied, wondering where this line of questioning was leading. Tommy nodded seriously, as if this confirmed something he had been thinking about. So maybe they're not just wandering around for no reason. Maybe they're like the birds back on my colony. Every spring, all the birds would fly away from our settlement to have their babies somewhere safe, and then they'd come back when the babies were old enough to take care of themselves. The classroom fell into absolute silence. Dr. Kolat stopped, taking notes. Professor Quilm stared at the holographic display with new eyes. Tommy had just suggested that the void swimmers weren't migrating randomly at all. They were following parenting instincts, traveling to safe nursery areas to reproduce and raise their young. But Tommy, Professor Quilm said slowly, his mind racing through the implications, the migration timing doesn't correspond to any known reproductive cycles. Tommy tilted his head, thinking, maybe their babies take a really long time to grow up, like really, really long. The birds on my colony only went away for a few months, but what if void swimmer babies need years and years before they're ready to leave the nursery? Professor Quilm's hands trembled as he began adjusting the holographic display, overlaying reproductive data with migration patterns. The connections that emerged were staggering. When he extended the timeline to account for much longer developmental periods, the seemingly random migrations suddenly showed clear patterns. The void swimmers were indeed following parenting instincts, but on a timescale that no one had considered. Dr. Colette found her voice first. Young Rivers has just solved a 2-century-old mystery by comparing space whales to colonial songbirds. This is unprecedented. But Tommy wasn't finished. Also, maybe some of them go to different places because they're like aunts and uncles. My Aunt Emma always went to help my cousin take care of her new babies, even though Emma didn't have kids herself. Maybe some void swimmers help take care of babies that aren't even theirs. This second insight proved even more revolutionary. When Professor Quilm analyzed the data for altruistic migration patterns, he found clear evidence of void swimmers traveling to assist in child-rearing activities for other family groups. The species had a complex social structure based on extended family relationships that spanned star systems. Word of Tommy's breakthrough spread through the Institute within hours. By evening, delegation after delegation of academics had arrived to witness the human child who was revolutionizing xenobiology through elementary school logic. They came expecting to study an anomaly, and instead found themselves questioning their entire approach to education and research. Dr. Ilanis Vel, the Institute's Director of Advanced Studies, called an emergency faculty meeting that night. We have a problem, she announced to the gathered professors. A 12-year-old human has just accomplished more in 3 months than our graduate programs have achieved in decades. Either our entire educational system is fundamentally flawed, or this child represents a form of intelligence we don't understand. The key meeting that followed lasted until dawn. Professor after professor stood up to share similar stories from their own fields. Tommy had been asking questions in the hallways, innocent queries that revealed gaps in long-established theories. His simple observations were overturning assumptions that had guided galactic science for centuries. Dr. Kamal from the physics department reported that Tommy had solved the resonance problem in quantum tunneling by asking why particles couldn't just knock on the door instead of trying to break through walls. Dr. Laren from cultural studies mentioned that Tommy's questions about why different species couldn't just share their toys had led to breakthroughs in interspecies cooperation theory. The child wasn't just learning from his classes, he was teaching the teachers, and they were beginning to understand that something profound was happening at their institution. The rigid hierarchy of academic knowledge was being challenged by a young mind that approached every problem with fresh curiosity instead of learned limitations. Professor Quilm found himself defending Tommy when some faculty member suggested the boy should be transferred to a specialized program for gifted individuals. You're missing the point, Quilm argued. Tommy isn't succeeding because he's a genius in the traditional sense. He's succeeding because he's not trained to accept that certain questions can't be asked or that certain connections can't be made. The debate continued, but one thing became clear. Tommy Rivers had changed everything. His presence at the Institute had revealed that wisdom didn't always come from extensive education, and that the most profound insights often emerged from the simplest perspectives. As the faculty meeting finally ended, Professor Quilm realized that his classroom had become something unprecedented in galactic education. It wasn't just a place where knowledge was transmitted from teacher to students. It had become a collaborative space where learning flowed in all directions, where a human child could teach ancient beings to see their universe with new eyes. The paradigm was shifting, and there was no going back to the old ways of thinking about intelligence, education, or the nature of understanding itself. The emergency session of the Galactic Council of Sciences convened on the neutral space station Harmony Point, but there was nothing harmonious about the heated debates that erupted as soon as the delegates gathered. Representatives from 1,000 different worlds had come to discuss what many were calling the most significant discovery in the history of galactic civilization: the cognitive capabilities of a species that most had dismissed as primitive. Admiral Threx of the Signan Defense Force stood at the central podium, his forearms gesturing emphatically as he addressed the assembly. We must consider the implications of what we have learned about human mental development. If a single juvenile human can outperform our most educated scholars, what does this mean for our understanding of their entire species? The revelation had started 3 months ago when Professor Quilm published his research on human cognitive patterns. The paper, titled Intuitive Problem Solving in Developing Human Neural Networks, had sent shockwaves through academic institutions across the galaxy, but it was the accompanying video recordings of Tommy Rivers in action that truly captured everyone's attention. Dr. Miranda Walsh, humanity's first representative to the Galactic Council, had arrived on the space station 2 days earlier. She was a xenobiologist herself, one of the humans who had made first contact with the galactic community 3 years ago. Now she found herself in the impossible position of trying to explain her own species to beings who had been studying intelligence for millennia. What you have to understand, Dr. Walsh addressed the assembly, is that Tommy isn't unusual among human children. What you're seeing as extraordinary cognitive ability is actually normal human development. Our children naturally think in ways that we maintain throughout our lives, unless we train ourselves out of it. The statement caused an uproar among the delegates. How could an entire species possess cognitive capabilities that other civilizations considered highly advanced? The Meridian educational representative stood up, her blue skin darkening with confusion. Dr. Walsh, our analysis indicates that human neural development includes pattern recognition abilities that we spend decades teaching our most gifted students. Are you claiming this is universal among your species? Dr. Walsh nodded. Creative, problem-solving, intuitive leaping, emotional learning, and what you call beginner's mind thinking are all standard components of human cognitive development. We've been so focused on matching your formal educational systems that we haven't realized how unique our natural learning processes actually are. In the viewing gallery above the main floor, Tommy Rivers sat with Professor Quilm and Dr. Kolat, watching the proceedings with wide eyes. He had been brought to the station as a case study, though the adults were careful to frame it as a special field trip, rather than letting him know he was the subject of intense scientific scrutiny. To Tommy, it was just exciting to see so many different types of aliens in one place. Why are they all so upset? Tommy whispered to Professor Quilm. Did I do something wrong? Professor Quilm felt his heart's ache at the innocence in the boy's voice. No, Tommy, you haven't done anything wrong. They're just trying to understand how your mind works, and it's making them question things they thought they knew. Below them, the debate was growing more intense. The Vorthak delegation had been analyzing human brain scans and neural activity patterns for weeks. Their representative, a tall crystalline being whose harmonic voice filled the chamber, presented their findings. Our analysis indicates that human children process information through multiple parallel pathways simultaneously. While our species develops this capability through advanced training, humans appear to be born with it. Furthermore, their emotional integration with analytical thinking creates synthesis patterns that we have never observed in nature. Dr. Thania Rex from the Pan-Galactic University Consortium spoke next, her voice tight with concern. If humans possess these capabilities naturally, we must reconsider our entire approach to interspecies relations. We have been treating humanity as a developing civilization based on their technology level, but their cognitive abilities suggest they may be more advanced than many of our member species. The implications were staggering. Trade agreements, territorial assignments, and cultural exchange programs had all been structured around the assumption that humanity was a young, intellectually developing civilization that needed guidance from more established galactic powers. If human cognition was actually superior in certain areas, those relationships would need to be completely reconsidered. Dr. Walsh tried to bring calm to the situation. "We're not claiming superiority," she said. "Human cognition has strengths and weaknesses, just like every species. What we've learned from Tommy's success is that different types of intelligence can complement each other. The students in Professor Quilm's class aren't just learning from Tommy. He's learning from them too." But her words did little to ease the growing tensions. The hegemony of Alderaan had built their entire society around intellectual hierarchy and academic achievement. Their representative, a tall being with multiple sensory organs, was visibly agitated. "You are suggesting that our fundamental understanding of intelligence is flawed, that centuries of educational development have been based on incorrect assumptions." The session was interrupted when Tommy stood up in the viewing gallery and waved at the delegates below. His simple, friendly gesture caught the attention of many representatives, who looked up to see the small human child who had caused such a disruption in their understanding of the universe. "Hi, everyone," Tommy called out, his young voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "Thank you for letting me come to your space station. It's really cool here." The effect of his greeting was immediate and unexpected. The heated arguments stopped. Delegates who had been shouting at each other moments before found themselves smiling at the boy's enthusiasm. Several beings waved back, momentarily forgetting the serious nature of their debate. It was Dr. Zephyr from the Institute for Cognitive Studies who first understood what they were witnessing. "Look around you," she said to the assembly. "A moment ago we were engaged in territorial disputes over intellectual hierarchy. Then a human child greets us with simple friendliness, and we all instinctively respond with warmth and connection. This is exactly what Professor Quilm has been trying to tell us about human cognition." The observation sparked a new round of discussions, but these were different from the heated arguments that had preceded them. Delegates began sharing their own experiences with human creativity, their observations of human problem-solving, and their growing understanding that intelligence wasn't a single, measurable quantity, but a complex spectrum of capabilities. Tommy, meanwhile, had become fascinated by a group of gaseous beings near the back of the chamber. He pointed them out to Professor Quilm with obvious delight. "Look at those ones. They're like clouds that can think. Do you think they dream in colors?" His question, overheard by nearby delegates, launched an entirely new discussion about the nature of consciousness in non-solid beings. Once again, Tommy's innocent curiosity had cut straight to the heart of a complex theoretical issue that scholars had been debating for decades. As the session continued into its second day, a consensus began to emerge. Humanity represented not a threat to galactic civilization, but an opportunity. Their unique cognitive abilities could complement existing educational and research methodologies. Their natural creativity and emotional intelligence could help solve problems that pure logic and memory retention couldn't address. The final resolution established the Human Cognitive Integration Protocol, a framework for incorporating human thinking patterns into galactic educational systems. Universities would begin experimenting with mixed-species classes, emotional learning techniques, and collaborative problem-solving methods. But perhaps more importantly, the Council recognized that intelligence itself was more diverse and valuable than they had ever imagined. Tommy Rivers, a 12-year-old human child who just wanted to learn and make friends, had shown them that wisdom could come from the most unexpected sources. As the delegates prepared to return to their home worlds, many stopped by the viewing gallery to meet Tommy personally. They came expecting to encounter some kind of cognitive phenomenon, and instead found a cheerful boy who asked them about their families, their favorite foods, and whether they had any pets back home. It was exactly what they should have expected from a human, and exactly what they needed to complete their education. 2 years after Tommy Rivers first walked into Professor Quilm's classroom, the Andromeda Learning Institute looked nothing like the traditional academic institution it had once been. The sterile lecture halls had been replaced with collaborative, learning spaces where beings of all ages and species worked together on projects that would have been impossible under the old educational system. Professor Quilm stood in what was now called the Discovery Center, watching a group that perfectly embodied the revolution Tommy had started. A young Keldon, barely past their first molt, was working with a centuries-old Vorthak scholar and two human teenagers who had arrived just months ago. Together, they were solving a complex problem involving atmospheric composition on frontier worlds, and their solution was more elegant than anything the previous graduate-only system had ever produced. Tommy, now 14 and showing the first signs of the growth spurt that would eventually make him taller than his professor, was helping a newly arrived Zentaurian child adapt to the mixed-species learning environment. The Zentaurians were a proud species that traditionally kept their young in isolated educational pods until they reached intellectual maturity at age 50. But after seeing the results of the human integration protocols, they had begun sending some of their children to participate in the collaborative programs. Remember, it's okay not to know everything, Tommy was telling the young Zentaurian, whose name was roughly translated as Bright Thought Rising. The best part about learning with everyone else is that somebody always knows something you don't, and you know stuff they don't. That's what makes it fun. Professor Quilm smiled as he remembered his initial horror at finding a child in his advanced class. Now he couldn't imagine teaching any other way. The old system of age-segregated, species-segregated learning had produced scholars who were experts in narrow fields but often missed the broader connections that made knowledge truly useful. The new system produced learners who could adapt, create, and collaborate across any boundary. Dr. Miranda Walsh approached him, carrying a data tablet full of the latest reports from universities across the galaxy. As humanities coordinator for the Cognitive Integration Protocol, she had spent the past 2 years helping other institutions implement the changes that had started at the Institute. The results from the Spiral Arm Educational Consortium just came in, she told Professor Quilm. Student satisfaction is up 300%, breakthrough discoveries have increased by 40%, and they're reporting that their mixed-age classes are outperforming traditional graduate programs in every measurable category. Professor Quilm nodded, though he was more interested in the unmeasurable categories. The new system wasn't just producing better academic results, it was creating learners who were happier, more confident, and more connected to their communities. Species that had barely interacted for centuries were forming friendships and collaborative partnerships that were strengthening the entire galactic civilization. There's something else, Dr. Walsh continued. The hegemony of Alderaan has finally agreed to participate in the pilot program. They want to send some of their young to study here. This was significant news. The hegemony had been the most resistant to the cognitive integration protocols, viewing them as a threat to their hierarchical society. Their decision to participate represented a major breakthrough in galactic acceptance of the new educational philosophy. Across the Discovery Center, a commotion drew their attention. A group of students had gathered around a holographic display, their excited voices mixing in a symphony of different languages and communication styles. At the center of the group was Tommy, gesturing enthusiastically as he explained something to his classmates. Professor Quilm and Dr. Walsh moved closer to see what had captured everyone's attention. The display showed data from a recently discovered star system, one that appeared to have planets capable of supporting life, but showed no signs of actual biological activity. What if they're just really good at hiding? Tommy was saying to the group. Like, what if there's life there, but it's so different from what we expect that we can't see it with our normal ways of looking? It was exactly the kind of question that Tommy had been asking for 2 years, the kind that challenged assumptions and opened new possibilities. But now, instead of surprising his classmates, it was inspiring them to build on his ideas. Bright Thought Rising, the young Zentaurian, added to the discussion with the systematic analysis skills that were natural to their species. A human teenager named Alex contributed creative possibilities drawn from science fiction stories she had read. The elderly Vorthak provided mathematical frameworks for testing their hypotheses. Professor Quilm realized he was witnessing something that would have been impossible under the old system. These students weren't just learning from their teachers, they were teaching each other, building on each other's strengths and creating new knowledge through collaborative thinking. Professor Quilm, Tommy called out, having noticed his teacher watching the group. Come help us figure this out. We think there might be invisible life forms on these planets, but we need to figure out how to prove it. Professor Quilm joined the circle of students, settling into the collaborative dynamic that had become natural over the past 2 years. In the old system, he would have been the authority figure dispensing knowledge. Now he was simply another contributor to the learning process, albeit one with more experience to draw upon. "What makes you think the life forms might be invisible?" he asked, genuinely curious about their reasoning. Alex, the human teenager, spoke up first. "Well, we've been studying the atmospheric readings, and there are chemical signatures that suggest biological processes but no visual confirmation of organisms. Tommy suggested they might be hiding, which got us thinking about camouflage and adaptation." Bright Thought Rising added their systematic perspective. "I have calculated the probability matrices for various forms of biological concealment. The most likely scenarios involve either microscopic life forms below our current detection thresholds or organisms that exist partially in dimensional phases we cannot easily observe." The elderly Vorthak chimed in with harmonic frequencies that translated to mathematical equations. Their calculations showed that life forms existing primarily in electromagnetic spectrums outside normal visual ranges could indeed leave the chemical signatures they were observing while remaining visually undetectable. Tommy listened to all these sophisticated analyses with the same intense attention he had shown in his first class, then asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. But why would they want to hide? I mean, if they're smart enough to stay invisible, maybe they're doing it on purpose. Maybe they don't want to be found. The simple observation shifted the entire discussion. Instead of treating invisibility as a biological accident or evolutionary adaptation, Tommy had suggested it might be an intelligent choice. The implications were staggering. If the life forms were deliberately concealing themselves, it raised questions about their level of development, their reasons for hiding, and whether attempting to contact them would be ethical. Dr. Walsh, who had been observing the discussion, felt the familiar sensation that always accompanied Tommy's breakthrough moments. The boy had done it again, taking a complex scientific puzzle and revealing an entirely new dimension that the experts had overlooked. "You know," she said to Professor Quilm quietly, "this is exactly what the Galactic Council was hoping would happen when they established the cognitive integration protocol. Different types of minds working together to solve problems that none of them could handle alone. The pilot program that had started with Tommy's accidental placement had now expanded to over 300 institutions across the galaxy. Each one reported similar results. Mixed-age, mixed-species learning environments consistently outperformed traditional educational methods. But more importantly, they were producing graduates who approached problems with flexibility, creativity, and collaborative skills that were transforming galactic society. The success had led to the establishment of the Rivers Protocol, named after Tommy and formalized as official galactic educational policy. The protocol recognized that intelligence came in many forms, that wisdom didn't always correlate with age or formal education, and that the best solutions often emerged from diverse groups working together. Tommy, meanwhile, had become something of a celebrity throughout the galactic academic community, though he remained remarkably unaffected by the attention. He still asked the same innocent questions that had revolutionized xenobiology. He still got excited about lunchtime and had to be reminded to clean up his workspace. He was still fundamentally a human child who loved to learn and make friends. But he was also something more. He had become a symbol of what was possible when beings approached each other with curiosity instead of judgment, when they valued different perspectives instead of demanding conformity, and when they remembered that learning was supposed to be joyful rather than competitive. The afternoon session in the Discovery Center continued with the students developing a research proposal for studying the potentially invisible life forms. Their plan incorporated Zentorian systematic analysis, Vorthak mathematical modeling, human creative problem-solving, and collaborative methodologies that had become standard practice under the Rivers Protocol. Professor Quilm watched his students work together and realized that Tommy had given the galaxy more than just a new educational system. He had reminded them that intelligence was not a hierarchy to be climbed, but a community to be built. Tikar, boy who had accidentally walked into the wrong classroom, had shown them all that there was no such thing as a wrong place to learn, as long as everyone was willing to teach and be taught. As the day ended and the students began to disperse to their various dormitories and living spaces, Tommy approached Professor Quilm with the same expression he had worn on that first day 2 years ago. It was a look of curiosity and wonder, of someone who saw the universe as an endless source of interesting questions, rather than a collection of problems to be solved. "Professor," Tommy said, "do you think we'll ever run out of things to learn about?" Professor Quilm smiled, remembering when he thought he understood the limits of knowledge and the proper ways to pursue it. "No, Tommy. I think every answer we find just shows us how many more questions there are to ask. And thanks to you, we now know that the best way to find those answers is together." Tommy grinned and headed off to join his friends for dinner, leaving Professor Quilm alone in the Discovery Center. The professor looked around at the space that had once been a traditional lecture hall and was now a vibrant hub of collaborative learning. The transformation was remarkable, but it was only the beginning. Across the galaxy, young minds of every species were learning to work together, to value each other's unique perspectives, and to approach the universe with the kind of wonder that had once been trained out of them by rigid educational systems. The future belonged to learners who could adapt, create, and collaborate, and Tommy Rivers had shown them all how to build that future one question at a time.